Welcome, everyone. I'm Sue Barber, author, former IT director for a Fortune 500 company, turned executive coach, and this is the Visibility Factor podcast, where we explore how to raise your visibility and play bigger at work and in life. We'll explore key topics and welcome guests that help you shift your thinking about yourself so you can see new possibilities for your leadership. I'm on a mission to create a visibility movement for leaders to show their value and be seen for their true talent. Are you ready to take the next step towards a higher level of visibility for yourself? Let's go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Visibility Factor podcast. This is Sue Barber, your host. My guest today, Kris Kelso, is here to talk about his book, Overcoming the Impostor. And I'm so thrilled to talk about this. As you guys know, I talk about this topic a lot, but I think it's really interesting that Kris wrote this book coming a little bit from a different perspective than maybe a lot of people might think about. A lot of people think it's coming from women. And Kris is going to be providing the male perspective today. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. Welcome to the show, Kris.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I'm so excited to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Excellent. So if you wouldn't mind doing a brief introduction of yourself so that everybody can learn a little bit about you and where you come from.
Yeah, I have spent the majority of my career as an entrepreneur. Came from a technology background, but haven't done a lot in tech the last several years. I founded a couple of companies. One was a consulting firm that was focused on IT. Another one was a technology platform company that I co-founded and ran for several years. But for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been working independently as a leadership coach and doing leadership development, as well as a lot of public speaking and writing. I published a book, as you mentioned, and so I work primarily with small business owners and their leadership teams, and I just love the work that I get to do and the impact that I get to have when I work with those groups.
Yeah, so we have a lot in common, coming from IT backgrounds and authors and leadership development.
Yes.
So all three of my favorite topics. So let's start with how you define imposter syndrome. Everybody has their own kind of view of it. I think it would be good to start there at the base, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, the term imposter syndrome was actually coined in the 1970s. So it's been around for a little while, and it refers to the tendency of many people, it turns out, to overvalue other people's accomplishments and undervalue or even doubt the reality of their own success. And so when you wrestle with imposter syndrome, you look at someone else. I might look at Susan and say, well, she's successful because she's smart and savvy and she has a plan and she executes it well and she just seems to make all the right moves and know what she's doing. Whereas my success, on the other hand, has involved a lot of luck and timing, and things just happen to go my way. And boy, I sure have made a lot of mistakes along the way that I just somehow managed to figure my way through and get over them. But the underlying fear is that sooner or later, somebody or everybody is going to figure out that I really don't know what I'm doing, that I'm just making it up as I go. And that if that happens, I'm going to be exposed as a fraud, as an imposter. And then, the irrational side of it is that if that happens, it's all going to come crumbling down around me, right? I'm going to be undone by this discovery that I'm not really what everybody seems to think that I am.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that was an excellent explanation. I think it's good to use people and help them understand how it really happens in your head, right? Because, to your point, by all accounts, this person is very successful, getting accolades and probably getting promoted even, right? And everybody would say, rock star, right? There's no way that person isn't doing well. And it definitely happened to me. And I know you and I've kind of talked about that. And it was like this invisible challenge, right? That I had that nobody knew about. And I certainly didn't tell anybody that it was happening for me. So I'm curious, did that happen for you as well?
Absolutely. It is very much an internal battle. And there's a couple of really interesting things about imposter syndrome that I learned as I began to study it. Before I wrote this book, I spent a couple of years studying this phenomenon. And number one, it's more prevalent among high achievers. So the more ambitious you are, the more driven you are, the more you're stretching yourself and trying new things, the more likely you are to run into situations where you feel in over your head, inadequate, ill-prepared, whatever the case may be. And so, but it's also that internal battle, that fear of other people figuring out that you aren't all that they think you are, causes us to withdraw and to sort of suffer in silence in a way. Most people who have imposter syndrome, especially if they haven't heard it really talked about, they think they're the only one. And that's the most common response I get when I talk to a new group or to someone who has never really heard or studied this before, is they say, oh my goodness, I thought it was just me. And that's how we all feel. So even though statistically it's more like 70 to 80% of the population experiences imposter syndrome, the very nature of it makes you feel like you're the only one and you can't tell anybody, because telling someone will expose the fact that you have insecurities, and that's what you're afraid of.
Right. You're trying to hide that situation, right? So I am curious, because what I learned, and I know you quoted kind of the origination of imposter syndrome back in the 70s, and I also found the same, right? And those studies were originally very focused on women. And I'm curious to see have you seen any research specifically on men? And what do you feel like, how do men experience it maybe different than women?
Yeah, I have seen research on men and women, and I've read dozens of research studies in preparation for my book and the speech that I've been giving, and some of the work that I've done with business leaders around this topic. And so what I've seen is, yes, the early research, it was, again, we're going back to the 1970s. It was very focused on sort of women in corporate America, women entering the, quote, man's world of business, and the struggles that women had feeling like they could measure up. But before too long, someone figured out that men get insecure too. And more recent studies, many of them have shown that imposter syndrome affects men and women equally. There's no difference in how often, how frequent, or how powerful it is. There is a difference, though, in the willingness to talk about it. And women tend to be more willing to open up and acknowledge it, whereas men are more likely to either not even know about it, not acknowledge it, not look into it or study it at all, or even when they're confronted with it, to be sort of in denial and not want to talk about that kind of insecurity. It's a vulnerability issue, and women tend to be more willing to be vulnerable with that.
Yeah, I've seen the same. And I do think it's true. It's almost like, for us, it's in our heads. For women, it's in our heads. And for men, I think sometimes it shows up in the actions that they take or don't take because of those insecurities in their head. What has your experience been with either clients or people that you're speaking to? Have they given you examples, specifically men, about what they've done or how they felt about this? And have you seen a difference between what they see and what women see?
I don't know if I've seen a difference in men and women in their actions or how it plays out, other than that willingness to sort of confront it and acknowledge it. But I definitely have heard many stories, and I wrote a bunch of stories that were shared with me in the book, of people who self-sabotaged. And, what happens is you feel insecure, so you worry and you try to wear these masks and play this part that you think people expect you to play. And you do things like avoiding risky situations, or avoiding taking on a big project or work, avoiding giving a presentation or talking to people, or putting yourself in a situation where you feel like you might be exposed. And what happens is that avoidance becomes self-sabotage. You sabotage your own career. And I actually have a story in the book of a guy who was fast rising in a really large company, and he was doing great work, but he started missing meetings and falling behind on assignments and letting things go. And he eventually was fired, and he looked back and realized he did it to himself. It was a self-confidence issue because he felt like he was having so much success that he didn't deserve it. And that fear of failure, that fear of not living up to the opportunities that he was being given became a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You convince yourself you're going to fail, so you fail. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be that way. But that's where this imposter syndrome goes from being just a negative feeling to an actual detrimental, holding us back, hurting us. It creates stress, anxiety. It affects our sleep, our health. I mean, it affects in so many ways that are far beyond just the psychological battle of feeling insecure.
Yeah, well, that's definitely some of my own story with the self-sabotage for sure. And I think it's true, everybody has these thoughts, but they really are just thoughts at that point, right? But it does impact your actions at some point. The longer you have them, the more you believe them. Your thoughts are driven by your actions. So that was definitely my story. And I'll just share a little bit about that. And I'm interested to see what I'm going to ask you at the end of that story, which is, so I felt like I should be getting promoted, right? You should want to get promoted. But I wasn't really interested, I don't believe, in being a part of the senior leadership team. And I didn't see them as maybe people that I always agreed with, which that's fine, right? You don't always have to agree with the leadership team. But I think there was a part of it that I was worried I wasn't going to fit in. Like I was different. I looked at people first. Results, were also important, but I felt like only looked at results first, not people. So I felt like, am I going to fit in? And so I think some of that impacted my ability to show up in the best way, my ability to go and present to them in the best way. And I guess I viewed it later, after I left the company, as a bit of self-protection. And so I'm curious if you've seen anything around like the self-protection side of you're doing something to keep yourself safe, and you may not realize it at the time.
A big theme in my book and when I talk about this is the fear of failure. That imposter syndrome, there's a voice inside your head that is trying to convince you that your success isn't real, that is sort of telling you this story that that failure of any kind, even a little mistake, is going to be fatal. That a failure on your record is going to mar you and tarnish you, and it's going to be your undoing. And so it does push you into that safe space of don't take a risk, don't be vulnerable, don't do anything that you might not succeed at, because that failure is going to be detrimental. And the truth is that failure is a great learning opportunity. And that failure, in fact, is part of success. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's part of the process of success. And so the mind game that goes on with imposter syndrome is that I got to avoid failure. And again, that causes us to be risk averse. And so we self-sabotage. We don't take advantage of those opportunities. We don't take the promotion. We don't get up in front of the group. We don't accept the key project or the big client or, whatever that thing is that, yes, there's risk involved. I've developed a mantra as I've learned that to see failure as a learning opportunity, that failure is learning and learning is part of the road to success. My mantra now is when I try something new, I'm either going to succeed or I'm going to learn. Those are the two options that I have. And either one of those is a positive outcome. It may not be the outcome I want, but it's a step in the right direction. And so that's really one of the key mindset shifts that I lay out in the book of around overcoming imposter syndrome, is to reframe failure as learning and to allow yourself to take those risks, knowing that yeah, it may not work out the way you hope it works out, but there is at a minimum a great learning opportunity there that's going to propel you to the next success.
Wow, I have so many places I want to go with that. So I'm gonna start here though. In your research or in the stories that you found in the, interviewing people for the book, is there something that you found that is like a key moment in someone's life that really starts this imposter syndrome happening for them? Because I was trying to think back in my own world, right? Like, when did I really start to lose confidence?
Yeah.
Start to doubt myself? And the only thing I can come up with is that I wasn't an IT educated person. And so I wondered in, looking back on it now, if that is, although by all accounts, everyone's like, "You're doing great, Sue. We love you, blah, blah, blah." But I think in my head, I was always thinking, well, I don't have the education for this. Am I really able to be successful here like they are?
Yeah, there's a number of ways that imposter syndrome can be sort of triggered in your life. And one of them is sort of what you've outlined is you try something new, you get into sort of new territory, and you have a measure of success that feels unwarranted because you didn't do it the way you've seen everybody else do it. When I started my first business, I had no business education whatsoever. In fact, I don't even have a college degree. I never went to college. And that became a major source of insecurity and fear for me, that I worried that one day everybody would figure out that I didn't have a degree, and therefore I didn't deserve to be an entrepreneur, to be a business owner, to be a consultant, whatever I was doing. And so often it's moving into something new, and especially having a little bit of success in something new that sort of surprises you can suddenly trigger this feeling of, okay, maybe this is an accident. Maybe I don't deserve this. Maybe I got it illegitimately. But there are other ways it can happen too. One story that's in the book, that a woman shared with me when she was really young. She was the youngest in her family, and all her life she had people around her who, whenever she struggled with something, they would step in and help. And she even told me she remembered playing with a toy and it wasn't quite working right, and an older sibling or an aunt or somebody just sort of jumped in and fixed it for her. And so she developed this belief that she couldn't ever do anything on her own. She always needed someone to show her how to do it right. So fast forward years later, she started her own business, and she didn't feel like she could start it by herself. So she kept trying to find partners, and she partnered with a couple of different people those partnerships didn't really work out well because they weren't a great fit. And she finally realized, as we were working together and talking about these ideas, that I was reaching for those partnerships not because they were good partnerships, but because I felt inadequate on my own. I just felt like I couldn't do it by myself. I had to have somebody else to be the expert alongside me. And so she had this aha moment, and she started to forge ahead on her own with her business. Now, she still hired consultants and coaches and experts to help her with things. It's not that we don't ever need anybody else's help, but she was able to develop the mindset of, I can figure these things out. I can learn what I need to learn, and I can do it myself. And she recognized that a pattern from her childhood had just put a limiting belief in her that developed into a form of imposter syndrome of I can't do it. I'm inadequate on my own.
Wow. Isn't that crazy, right? Like someone's just trying to help you and has no idea that they've placed this belief in your head. And, would never want to do that to someone. But, oh my gosh, that's a great story. I mean, I'm glad she was able to see the pattern and be able to move past it.
Yes. Yeah. And it's a world of difference now for her that she has gotten past that mindset. And so, one of the things about imposter syndrome, I think, that makes it so tough to connect with others and identify with others is that though it's very common, it is a unique experience for each person. right? I had imposter syndrome about my lack of a college degree. I've talked to people who have multiple advanced degrees, and they have imposter syndrome for a very different reason. In fact, some of them think that their degrees open up doors for them that they actually aren't qualified to walk through, that they get a job and then they don't really know what they're doing, and they're worried that their degree created a scenario where they're inadequate, which is, the opposite of the struggle that I had. So we each have our own reason for feeling like an imposter. It's a common phenomenon with very unique and specific implementations, if you will, in each of our lives. And that can make it hard to identify with people, because if I share my insecurity and you don't have that insecurity, then I feel like, well, it is just me. But if we can realize that we all wrestle with this comparison trap of trying to measure up to to other people's stories and trying to be just like the other examples we see around us, rather than appreciating our own unique journey and our own unique story, we can relate together in that struggle. We can connect on the idea that we all can get in our own head and have this mental battle of imposter syndrome that isn't really real. It's just a psychological trap that we fall into.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad. 70% of people, walking around with it every day, right? And I found the same. And all I can think about is the wasted potential, the wasted ideas that are not being shared.
Yeah.
Just the thought processes and things that they're holding in for fear of speaking up in a meeting, for fear of saying the wrong thing. It was definitely my experience too. And I think also I'm introverted, so that didn't help me either. Because I thought all these extroverted people, they know so much more, and they just talked more. That's all they did. They talked more.
That's another form of imposter syndrome, is introverts look at extroverts and say, well, they're good leaders and I'm not. And they have something I don't have and I can never be that. Instead of recognizing that there are different styles of leadership, and you can be an introverted, sort of the quiet strength style of leader. You don't have to be the bombastic, outgoing, very demonstrative leader that you might see someone else being. And that doesn't mean that they're wrong either. It's just different styles of leadership.
Yeah. And for me, I didn't want to be a bragger, right? And I saw those people as someone who bragged. And so that's why I had to learn how to be visible in my own way. And that's what led me to take my path towards the book, right? There's a lot of overlap, though, I think, between what you're talking about. And it's a whole chapter in my book for a reason, because it's the one thing that I think holds most people back from being visible or speaking up or doing the things that they really want to do to reach their potential.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the effect that it has individually with that self-sabotage and things we can do. But you also just touched on the effects that it has on society as a whole, and on organizations, where we lose out on great ideas. We lose out on talent when people aren't willing to step up and try something and lean into a craft or a skill that they don't feel fully confident in. And so we lose out when we create environments where people are afraid to acknowledge a weakness or an insecurity, and where they feel like they're only allowed to do something that they feel fully vetted and qualified and confident to do. So I think for leaders, it's really important to create environments and cultures where it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to acknowledge that I'd like to try something, but I don't feel fully confident, and I want to experiment, and it may not succeed on the first try, but we're going to learn in this process. And that does align with your message of visibility, of, helping people to step out of the shadow and to try something and make them feel safe in that experimenting, to be able to try something new and either succeed or learn in the process.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought up the manager side of this, because I think it's very true. You've always got introverts and extroverts on your team, and creating that space of safety for someone who's quieter to be able to feel comfortable and speak up, but then also behind the scenes encouraging them. Like, I love what you shared today. Keep doing that. That was amazing, right?
Yes.
They need to build their confidence up to be able to keep doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. When I talk to leaders, especially of businesses, on occasion, I hear someone who says, well, imposter syndrome is not an issue in our organization. We don't have people that are self-conscious or are insecure. And I immediately know some things about that organization, right? Number one, I know that leader is out of touch with their people, and that leader has probably created an environment where vulnerability is punished, where admitting a weakness means you're going to be reprimanded or demoted, or that there's risk in acknowledging a concern or a fear or a worry or just a insecurity. Because it's 70% or so of the population, you just know statistically that there's no way that you have a company of any real size where it's not at play. And so if you're not hearing about it, if you're not talking about it, it probably means people are afraid to talk about it, and it needs to be talked about. Those are the environments where someone needs to speak up and say, this is something we need to discuss, and we need to help the people who are struggling in silence to feel comfortable to speak up, talk to a mentor, talk to a manager, talk to a coach, give them an avenue to process those feelings. Because what it'll do for them is it'll allow them to reset their perspective. When you struggle with imposter syndrome and you struggle in silence, your reality gets warped. You get this self-image that is usually so far below what you really are capable of, and you do begin to self-sabotage and to downplay and downgrade your capabilities. And nobody wants their people doing that in their organization. So allowing them to talk through it and making it safe to acknowledge these feelings actually gives people an opportunity to open up and discuss it and then begin to get over it. This is one of the biggest learnings that I discovered in my research and study for this book, is that imposter syndrome is the fear of vulnerability. It's the fear of letting people know who and what you really are. And yet, vulnerability is the antidote. Vulnerability is the solution. If you can open up and talk about what's going on, then when you connect with people, it actually builds your confidence, and you start to reset that perspective that, my worries are not as big as they seemed inside my head. And the struggles that I'm facing are not as insurmountable as I thought they were, now that I have help, now that I have support. And so vulnerability is the antidote. The very thing you fear when you have imposter syndrome is exactly what you need to overcome it. Yeah.
Let's normalize it and talk about it. And, again, it's I kind of view it as your confidence builds when you take action. And so even if those actions are small, but it's putting you out of your comfort zone a bit, it starts to build your confidence. And to your point, that's what starts to lessen the power that imposter syndrome or your thoughts might have over you. So I love that you brought that up.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons that I've chosen to talk about this and to get really open and honest with my journey. And, going back to the beginning of the discussion about men versus women, I felt compelled as a middle-class white male American that I needed to write and speak on this topic so that people who were not like me, who assumed that white male Americans did not struggle with this kind of thing, would know that it's not a woman's problem. It's not a minority problem. It's not a poor person's problem. It's a human problem. And so I felt like I needed to speak up in order to benefit the women who are struggling and think it's just them, the minorities who are struggling and think it's just them, the less fortunate, the less well-connected, the whatever it is that is different that causes someone to think that they're the only one or they're the only class that deals with this. I'm here to say, no, you're not. And I've talked to people on almost every continent. I've talked to people from every, economic class and background and all types of job descriptions and ranks and profiles, and I've seen it everywhere. So we just need to own it and talk about it. And that's how we begin to overcome it.
Wow. I mean, I think to share how widespread you have seen it to be, I think is really impactful because, most people see within their own work, maybe their own home or family, but they don't often realize that it's happening everywhere in so many different ways. So if you could give the listeners maybe 3 of your top tips, if they've just discovered, maybe even just based on our conversation today, oh my gosh, that's what I have. What do you tell people to do?
So the way that you overcome it is fairly simple, but simple is not the same as easy. So I'm not going to pretend that these things are easy, all right? But number 1, I talked about the fear of failure, and you've got to see failure differently. You need to see failure as learning, and you need to see failure as not the opposite of success, but as part of the process of success. And I have a whole chapter and dozens of examples of famous people, from Thomas Edison to Babe Ruth to politicians, scientists, all kinds of examples of people who failed their way to success. To try to show that if you fear failure, you're actually you're gonna miss out on the success you want, because the pathway to get there is through failure sometimes. So that's the first mindset shift you've got to make. The second one, again, we've touched on, is this vulnerability piece. You've got to recognize that you need to be connected to people, and that you need authentic relationships where vulnerability is the norm, because vulnerability is what you fear, but it is also the antidote. And I talk in the book about how to use vulnerability as a test to figure out whether a community of people is going to serve you or hurt you in terms of your confidence. You can actually figure out whether a community is a place where vulnerability is accepted and allowed, and that's going to build your confidence, or where vulnerability is punished, because that's going to hurt your confidence. That's going to make your impostor syndrome worse. So community can work for you or against you, depending on the level of vulnerability involved. And my third tip is related to vulnerability, but it comes from a little bit different angle, because one of the symptoms of impostor syndrome is the inability to accept a compliment at face value. Right? What happens is somebody pays us a compliment, and we downplay it, or we deflect it, or my go-to is sarcasm, making a joke about how the bar is low, or whatever. And I had this realization that when someone pays you a compliment and you downplay or deflect it, you're actually insulting that person. That they've handed you a gift, and you've taken the gift and said, it doesn't really mean that much to me. I'm going to set it over here. And we would never do that, right? But when you downplay someone's compliment, you're either telling them that they don't know what they're talking about, or that their opinion doesn't matter. And so it's potentially insulting, and we don't realize we're doing that. We're not trying to be insulting. In fact, sometimes we think we're being humble. False humility and managing your image is really a form of pride, and it's also detrimental. That's not being authentic either, when you're trying to appear humble. So what I challenge my community to do, what I challenge my audiences to do when I'm speaking, and what I challenge my readers in the book to do is just to make a decision that you're going to stop doing that. That when someone pays you a compliment, you're going to just plant your feet, look them in the eye, and say, thank you. I worked really hard on that, and it's so good to know that my work is appreciated. Just acknowledge it and own it.
I love all 3 of those tips so much, because I was definitely that person too. Like, oh, no, it's no big deal, right? Or deflecting, or even the words I would use were very diminishing and devaluing to the work that I was doing and my team. So I think that, if nothing else, listeners, please take those 3 tips to heart, because they will make such a difference and really help you to move the needle on how you think about yourself, how you start to show up, and how you can show up for your team if you're leading a team. So, Kris, we're going to transition into what I call Rise Up and Be Visible Quick Tips. And these are 4 questions that I ask everybody at the end of the episode. So the first one, visibility is?
Visibility is an important factor in your impact.
Wow. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, if you're invisible, it's hard to have influence in the room. It's hard to affect the atmosphere. And so the level of visibility that you have puts a limit or is an accelerator to the level of impact that you can have on people around you. So, sometimes in the marketing space and in the, I'm in that sort of speaker, author, thought leader category, and visibility and self-promotion and marketing and stuff can feel like, well, I'm just trying to pump myself up. And I've come to the conclusion that no, I need to be visible so that I can have an impact. The more people that know my name, that have heard me, that hear my message, the more people I can affect for good. And it's not about me, it's about the effect I can have on others. So I think that visibility is a critical component that you have to embrace and pay attention to and work on if you want to have an impact on the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone described it to me about being an author, right? If you wrote a good book, you have a responsibility to talk about it,
yes,
to let others know about it, right? If you're not doing that, then why did you even write the book?
Yeah.
So it was really, I hold that dear because I feel like that's something I always think about in a big way when I'm talking about stuff. Okay, second question. How do you yourself show up and be visible?
I show up in a lot of different ways. I once heard somebody say that if success is about being in the right place at the right time, then I want to be in a lot of places at a lot of times.
Love that.
And so I default to saying yes, sometimes to my detriment. Sometimes I put a few too many things on my calendar and I overcommit a little bit, and I'm continuing to work on that. But I want to be available, and I try to be generous with my time, and I try to show up for audiences and opportunities to be visible where I can, again, so that I can have an impact. I'm really focused, especially this year. One of the words that I'm thinking about and one of the concepts that I'm focused on is how can I have a greater impact?
Mm-hmm. Love that. All right, the next question. What is the best leadership or career advice you've ever received?
This has been said many times, and I think it may have been Zig Ziglar that originated this, but the saying goes, if you focus on helping other people get what they want, then you can eventually have everything that you want. And so I have tried, and I've sometimes been more successful at this than other times, but I've tried throughout my career to help first and to think about how I can help, the person in front of me or the group in front of me or my clients or the audience that I'm speaking to. How can I benefit them before I worry about how they benefit me? And usually that really pays off in the long run. It doesn't always pay off in the short run, but it definitely pays off in the long run.
Right. I totally agree. And what is a book you've read recently that you would recommend?
Oh, I have a good one, and it's called DIY Brain by Dr. Roger Hall, and it just came out. Roger Hall is a psychologist, and he's been a public speaker, and I've actually known him for years. But he wrote this book all about it's kind of mental hacks, how to understand enough about brain science to sort of leverage it in your favor, and to understand what's happening when you, for instance, experience stress or when you're trying to remember things. And so he has all these sort of mental hacks and what he calls mental monkeys that help you to remember things. And it's a great book, not just because I know Roger and I think he's a really smart guy, but it's a very entertaining. I laughed as I read it. And so he has a great blend of science and humor that makes it fun to read and really, really useful.
Wow, it sounds very practical too, right? Some good hacks you can apply quickly, hopefully, for whatever situation you're dealing with.
Yes, highly recommended.
Awesome. Well, thank you for being here. I would love to just share with the audience where they can reach out to you if they want to learn more about your book, learn more about you and what you're doing.
Yeah, I am easy to find online if you remember that my name starts with a K, K-R-I-S. Kelso, Kelso. So I'm at kriskelso.com. You can find out about the book at overcomingtheimposter.com. And in fact, at that site, you can get a free sample chapter of the book. And I think, in my opinion, it's one of the best chapters in the book. We did not give away the first chapter where all it does is tell you about the problem and not give you any solutions. It's actually chapter 7, which is a really meaty and valuable chapter with a lot of practical ideas and advice in there. So you can get a free sample at overcomingtheimposter.com.
Oh my gosh. Well, I love this conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And I'll put all the links for all of that in the show notes so everybody can find you. It's just been a pleasure to really reconnect with you and to have this conversation. And I know it's going to help so many people. So thank you for being here.
You are so welcome. And thanks for having me. I enjoyed this immensely.
Of course. All right. Thanks so much for joining us today on the Visibility Factor, and we'll catch you on the next one. Thanks so much for listening to the Visibility Factor podcast. Remember that visibility starts with small steps that are intentional and consistent each day. Be bold, be visible, be the leader you were meant to be. Find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Follow us on all of our social media platforms, which are highlighted in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Visibility Factor podcast.